All right, welcome back. Today we're going to kick it off on another great article from Protocol, and they really dig deeper into the impact and the reality of banning political ads by social media platforms. So at the end, I kind of reached a conclusion that, maybe the battle of regulation and banning ads on social media is basically a Kobayashi Maru. It's just a situation that's not really winnable, and the answer is just change the playing field. And I actually proposed something at the end of this episode, one where political advertisers and their consultants actually have a stake and a say in the platform itself. Does that sound crazy? Stay tuned. Welcome to Assembly Unfiltered. I'm your host, Satchel, and co-founder of Assembly, the Learn to Earn platform. Assembly Unfiltered is a podcast about democracy, privacy, blockchain, politics, leadership, company culture, crypto, security, and startups. It's meant for anyone who believes that all of us are living in challenging, turbulent, and even exciting times. We're living in a moment ripe for dramatic change. We envision this as a podcast for our tribe, people who share an interest in how all these threads weave together for better communities. This is meant for our learners, voters, advertisers, civic organizations, tech geeks, developers, and employees. I hope you enjoy this episode of Assembly Unfiltered. All right. So in this issue, the article talks about banning political ads and the challenges with political ads, and it just really highlights that this is not an unknown issue to tech giants. According to the article, Dorsey, who was the founder and the CEO of Twitter, wrote that political ads have become too susceptible to abuse, presenting entirely new challenges to civic discourse. It then goes on to give an illustration where this one-size-fit-all advertising is actually unfair. So even though they say it's a ban, there's still political activity, political influence occurring on these platforms. They're just sort of sideswiping it. So here is a quote from Eric Polyak, managing director of climate advocacy group 314. They launched this policy that really tilted the playing field. Instead of getting serious about disinformation on the platform, they've just gravitated towards this one-size-fits-all policy that really favors big corporations and penalizes advocacy groups like us. So that's sort of the big thesis that seems to be recurring through the article. There's another quote. According to the article, Twitter's prohibition on political ads, meanwhile, has effectively created a loophole for businesses while stymieing advocacy groups, said Stephanie Grasmick, CEO of the Democratic marketing firm Rising Tide Interactive. All this has made it increasingly expensive for smaller, less resourced political campaigns to advertise online. Now, this is a very, significant concern is if political advertising and these bans actually aren't true bans after all, but really are one-sided prohibitions of sort of those with lesser funding being able to get into it, then that's certainly a problem. But it's actually very difficult to understand what the issue is. And part of that is because there's a lack of research that's available. And so this is something that's also highlighted in the article. And it talks about some research that's done at UNC Center on Technology Policy, which found that bans likely had minimal impact on curbing misinformation, which is really sort of like a big problem with these social media platforms at scale. But they did seem to hurt smaller campaigns since digital ads are cheaper than other mediums. So we've got to look at the price impact that we're seeing. And it notes that in Facebook's case, because a lot of their data, I would argue, comes from third-party data and extensive tracking, when there's more privacy on the environment, particularly, say, through Apple's changes, their costs went up. So basically, because it was harder to reach them because they could no longer rely on tracking and third-party data and other privacy violations, their price has to go up, and they basically pass that on to their customer, the advertisers. So there's sort of an implicit problem. They have to make more money from their advertisers, charging them more when they can't violate privacy. That already is sort of one of the underlying challenges with the nature of these systems. Now, I won't actually let the advertisers completely off the hook. They are also somewhat complicit, because when Facebook was still violating privacy, they had no issues at all. It was just lower costs and higher returns. And they really didn't. So appealing on their social conscience really is probably not the play here to fix it. I acknowledge that there are some advertisers who recognize that at the extreme, some of this privacy and micro-targeting and the advocacy of fringe hate groups is probably a bad idea. In the end, that's probably, as one ad tech entrepreneur told me, the advertisers really don't care. And so that's probably true. So what do we do with that? What do we take away from this article? So I took away a couple of key ideas. Is that platforms really don't have an incentive to offer data to researchers, so they're really not going to do it. Any rule that they do at scale can often create uneven playing fields, and they're going to favor larger corporations who have more money, who have more to spend. That also just seems to make sense from their perspective. The privacy changes will, for most of these that don't have first-party consent data, will increase prices and have poor targeting results. And this increased scrutiny is continuing to be a concern for platforms. Some actually say they moved away from political advertising altogether, but actually just came back in with these odd workarounds. So what should a political advertiser actually do in this environment? And so here's where I propose there's an opportunity for them to support what I call a Web3 approach. And I know Web3 is just sort of like this horrible misnomer now, but really the way I see it is it's a way for the entire ecosystem to have sort of incentive dynamics kick in. And if you can keep those incentives broad enough, and in some cases adversarial, to keep a check and balance, then these broader societal issues, for which I think very few of these market actors actually care about, these societal issues have become tragedy of the commons dynamics, but we can try to address them better. And the tragedy of the commons in this case is just better operating democracy, which comes from better informed voters who are more engaged without violating their privacy. So this approach is actually, for these advertisers, is giving them governance and a financial stake in the actual platform. But that stake is also extended to watchdogs and voters or anybody else that can offer a kind of a balance. And this actually changes the dynamic of what the incentives are. When a centralized entity reports to Wall Street, they tend to have a very narrow, singular focus, and they won't be as well balanced in their decision making. And that is understandable. When the people who are making money or making the decisions, they're financially incentivized by ownership in the form of stock, and how the price goes up, they're going to do what the investors want. And that doesn't not make sense. It just, for something like social media and political advertising, is driving sort of bad behavior. However, if the decisions are now more decentralized and are offered around different stakeholders in the ecosystem, then that actually starts to address some of these issues. So, as I've described before, those actors include in broad buckets the actual voters or the people being advertised to. That they should have some kind of say or participation in it, because they're actually the ones making the money. They're the eyeballs that the product is being sold. The advertisers themselves, they should be able to have some say. They might be adversarial to the voters or the eyeballs that they're trying to reach. And then there's stakeholders, advocacy groups, research entities, fact checkers. I think we can kind of evolve around that. So, will distributed ownership solve everything? No, it could create some additional problems, but it's kind of like democracy. It's actually just a better solution that has its own challenges. As Churchill himself quipped, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. So what are the risks? Well, there is the risk that there's slowness in the platform making major decisions. There's acrimonious debate, but those mechanisms are being solved and addressed in a range of Web3 communities. And so I don't see that as necessarily bad. It just comes with a problem. The end goal still is just a better outcome where advertisers have a stake in the platform. Someone could argue, well, could there be just misalignment? Advertisers, if they have a stake in the platform, will prefer to be on the platform because they have a stake in it, and that's going to hurt. And so you could say that, but I actually think that there's an underlying argument to be made that incentive, if it gets sort of everybody onto the platform and off of big tech, there's sort of implicit disadvantages of staying on big tech at the same time. So I think I'll probably have to elaborate a little bit further into that. But the point of it is none of these platforms are going to be standalone, doing the right things. They're all going to be issues. So if we have to pick the lesser of two evils, let's have it where there's collective ownership around it. So to play devil's advocate, someone could say, well, maybe those advertisers with very large war chests would just prefer to be on a platform like Facebook and Twitter, which already tip the scale to their advantage. And so to that, I would say, well, the counterbalance to those with money are those who have another form of currency that can come into play when it comes to a platform that it needs, that's advertising driven. And so those organizations that have community, great engagement, missional values, really trusted content, those are things that advocacy groups may have, but they don't have deep pockets. And so if they're part of the ecosystem and they're incentivized to build the community and content on the new platform, that balances that. And that if they're driving the voters onto the platform, it becomes very hard for a well-heeled organization to completely ignore them. So the end goal is there's this push and pull game theory mechanics that's driving people to come onto this platform. And ultimately, people will recognize a level playing field is the best place to be. That is a principle that I believe in, that, the best idea on whichever side, the execution should be better. The campaign clarity, the reason, the arguments, those should just be the things that ultimately people make their decisions. Not because you have an advantage because it blocks the message of the others. Now, I actually see that could be a hurdle for some segments, those that are not market driven, those that aren't rational driven. I've met some in the process of, building out the platform with ideologues who have said they simply cannot stand the idea that their supporters could be exposed on our platform or on another to an opposing idea. And that just makes no sense to me. If your idea is actually good, it's solid, it's rational, it makes sense, then do battle in the battle of ideas. And your supporters presumably already believe in it, and their exposure to competing ideas really shouldn't sway them if the ideas were good standalone on themselves. If they weren't, if they were on sinking sand and not a solid foundation, that's a whole other thing altogether. And I think a platform which really drives people to like the best communication, the best idea, let people battle it out in ideas is the best thing. But the takeaway for this is maybe the way to solve it is thinking Web3. We're going to extend ownership and governance of the platform to all the parties. So tell me what you think. I just touched upon it lightly. I know there's a lot of questions around this, and we're going to go into a lot more detail at another episode, but invite your questions now. Until next time, thanks again.